Thank you. And why don't I start with my dad joke to my soccer team? What disease do ghosts get? The bubonic plague. Sorry, they didn't laugh either. All right. Hi there. I could do with a box to stand a little higher. It's kind of close here. Hi there. Thanks for having me. Great to speak at AusCert. Just a little bit of a background to my presentation. You'll notice on the screen here the label ISACA. I'm actually presenting on behalf of ISACA today. I work in a company of 6 people called Vital Advisory. We do advisory in IT governance, risk, security and assurance. But I've been volunteering for ISACA since 2003. In Sydney, I was a Sydney chapter president for a couple of years and on the board there for 9. But I've also been volunteering at the international level, including as treasurer, currently on the Audit and Risk Committee. I was international vice president for 2 years, and I chaired the CISM committee for about 6 as well. So I had a long involvement in CISM and the development of CISM and the implementation, rollout and maintenance of CISM as a certification. ISACA as an organisation is a global not-for-profit, so and interestingly 50 years old next year. So for 50 years we've been servicing the IT, back in the day it was called EDP auditors, a cohort of people, and since about 2000 we've been working more closely in the fields of information security, IT security, risk and governance. And the session today is based around some research that ISACA did just last year on governance, because there's some real challenges we face with governance. Let me ask, is there anybody in the room who is an ISACA member? Okay, so we've got a few. Those people that are put their hands up, have you seen the research called Better Business, Better Governance of Enterprise IT is Better for Business? Because the research that I'm going to talk about is based on that. One of the things, and welcome to the room, the new folks, you missed the 2 dad jokes, so you've already missed probably the highlight of the session, I would say. I'm going to skip my agenda. One of the things I want to start with is my view, I guess, that governance is fundamentally misunderstood. Many organisations use this label to mean all sorts of things, and rarely when I go in there do I find they actually mean governance. It goes back to the word to govern, to lead, to direct and guide a ship, if you like, towards achieving a goal or an outcome. And the slide you can see on the screen there is essentially a COBIT 5 diagram. And it starts with a very simple proposition that organisations, public or private, are out to deliver some value for some customer or client or stakeholder. The challenge for governors is that those values, and you can see up the top there, value creation, those values are different for different stakeholders. So governors have to balance a bunch of competing objectives. And those objectives are, and you can see in the slide there, benefits, and let me change that word, it's probably a 2010 word, 2005 to 10 word, benefits realisation. Let me just call that opportunities. Okay, that's probably the more common phrase we hear today. On one hand, governors need to balance opportunities. On the other hand, they need to balance the resources they have available to them today to deliver those outcomes that they're aiming to achieve. And in the middle, you'll see risk optimisation. You don't see risk management there, and you don't see risk mitigation there. You see optimisation. In other words, making the most of the opportunities we have with the resources we have and managing and getting outcomes from risks that we might choose to accept or we might choose to act on. Interestingly, what I'm seeing in organisations today is this real challenge, and back to the headline on my slide here, the inability for them to separate governance from management. And that's a real fundamental skill. Essentially, organisations can structure themselves however they like, but in essence, they need a function in that organisation that will govern and lead the managers that implement those processes and operations. So governance isn't something that only large organisations have. I've worked for CommBank, I've worked for Education Department in New South Wales, I've worked for very large organisations, and as a consultant I have a client who's a company of 9. This company of 9 became ISO certified. Actually, we helped them get certified in 47 days from start to certification certificate. And this company of 9 understood the need. They're a fintech startup. Their goal was to be global dominant in the next 3 to 5 years. They recognised from the establishment of their company that they needed to establish good governance and a governance process and governance frameworks. So for organisations as small as that, there is still the need to establish and separate governance from management. Let me talk a little bit about the slide that I have up there. You'll notice up the top it says business needs. I'd actually replace that with stakeholder needs, which is what you saw in the first slide. So stakeholders have requirements. Governors in an organisation evaluate the context of the business today, the risks, the resources, the opportunities, how they want to do what they want to do, their strategy, etc. And they give direction out to their organisation, to their managers, to go do that, go exercise my plan. Essentially, you'll see across the bottom there what looks a little like ISO or Quality Management, Plan, Do, Check, Act. It's a little different. This is built around the COBIT model. Now, the COBIT model is a process model for the operation of enterprise IT. So you see here, if you can align those with IT kind of functions, plan, build, run, monitor. And the governance model works on a feedback loop at any stage, not just at the end stage, but any stage through that, so governors can monitor what's happening, reevaluate and redirect as needed, which is very different from what I hear in a lot of organisations in terms of what they see as governance. So ISACA in 2017 did some research. It's publicly released, so it's called the 2017 Digital Transformation Barometer Research. And it was researching on the premise that organisations today, probably for of any time in history right now, technology is the most important element of doing good business. The survey research found that when organisations were asked whether their leaders were digitally literate, and the survey respondents were CEOs, CISOs, C-suite, board members, executives within organisation, this was the response. 53% believe their organisational leadership was digitally literate, at a time when digital literacy is probably paramount in delivering business services. So that means if you do simple maths, 47% felt that they were not literate enough or had no idea at all. And as well as the challenge around digital literacy amongst governors, there's also the challenge organisations face as to who's leading the evaluation and delivery execution of emerging technology in my organisation. And it was quite a disparate set of groups. The larger one there, IT, but we're starting to see functions called Chief Digital Officer and the like being created. So what it suggests, the research is suggesting, is that there's some really serious challenges around digital literacy amongst the leadership and the receptivity of that leadership to some evolving, emerging technology. I have another bit of data here. The research also found, and this slide was a little tricky to throw on the screen, but I'll read this out. The survey also found, or research also found, that almost half of the respondents anticipate facing challenges or resistance when deploying artificial intelligence, machine learning, cognitive technology, public cloud, if you can believe that one, and Internet of Things. They all ranked around the 47 to 50% mark. So organisations, leadership, as well as management are appearing to face challenges and resistance into how will we deliver this to meet enterprise goals and stakeholder needs. So there's some significant challenges emerging in terms of how we do these things. One of the other observations that we correlated our findings with was the NACD, so the National Association of Company Directors, which is a North American association. Their top 10 most critical uncertainties for organisations right now are these 10, and of those, at least 7 of them relate to the deployment of technology and the operation of technology in their business. The other 3 marginally so, but the other 7, definitely do. So there's a real crux right now, a real nexus for us to try and work how do we resolve better technology governance in enterprises. The research found this really interesting set of statistics up the top there. that 92% of respondents felt that there would be better economic outcomes, and 89% said better business agility through technology in their business and the deployment of evolving and improving technology. So they see it as really critical, but their capability to deploy it and handle and govern and lead it is challenged. So the converse of that was we only saw 21% of those leaderships believed that they were receiving briefing on risk topics at senior leadership meetings in relation to technology, in relation to IT governance or the governance of enterprise IT, in relation to risks that deal with digital and digitisation, and in relation to risks around cyber security. And only 29% of organisations are continually assessing risk in relation to how they are using technology. Organisations that still have legacy technology that's exploitable by vulnerabilities are probably good examples of those that aren't continually reassessing risk about legacy and the way in which they're investing in those sorts of technologies. So the research also identified some success factors. And it's interesting to note the top 4 for me on here. The top 4 are very closely aligned with my governance model at the beginning. The top 4, alignment between enterprise IT and what stakeholders need. So how does an organisation better combine or align what the enterprise stakeholders actually expect from technology and what IT is delivering, or IT service providers? So if we can get better alignment, then we get better outcomes is the intention here. The second one was measurement. The need for better measurement of results against goals was the second most important or critical success factor stated. The third one was strong leadership and guidance around how do we digitise our business processes, how do we manage our enterprise technology, and how do we do that for outcomes, for value? How do we do that to deliver what our stakeholders want us to deliver? The fourth one I've picked out there is strong engagement by business and employees. So the ability of the enterprise leadership, not just IT, but enterprise leadership be able to explain and understand the relationship of technology to the delivery of business services. The last 3 I've left there just for the sake of it in case they're of interest to you. So there's some really clear success factors that go back to the findings related to getting better outcomes that are also directly correlated to that governance and management framework that you recall from the beginning. So there's some really clear directions we can go in. So how are senior leaders handling their growing responsibilities for effective oversight? There's actually some interesting challenges in this one. So 9 in 10 senior leaders surveyed said that better governance for information technology, actually I did cover that one, would lead to better economic outcomes, and 2/3 suggested that they would have increased spending on risk management. But on the other side, we see more than 2/3 of organisations, top leaders, needing to prioritise this connection between IT and business. In other words, fewer organisations are doing that alignment and prioritisation with how does the business talk to IT and vice versa. And barely half of those surveyed agreed that their boards and executives are doing all they can to safeguard digital assets. In other words, half of those surveyed believe cybersecurity was undertaken well enough in their organisation. For me, I feel that's a little overstated potentially, that 53% is probably a little high there. So how do we shift some of the thinking? There were some interesting findings came out of this, and there's one on here that worried me to a degree from the findings, and maybe you can see if there's one on there that worries you as well. A couple of the takeaways that in order to better defend an organisation and falling into this technology governance gap, in other words, that governance of technology is occurring at the management layer by IT and not at the leadership layer of the business, in order to avoid falling into that gap, the approach that came out of the surveys, research, was firstly to analyse enterprise risk in relation to things like how it's correlating with cybersecurity budgets, and how technology expertise is represented in the boardroom. So some metrics in your organisation around the cybersecurity budgeting, where that is headed, the risks that you're capturing around that, as well as whether or not the organisation's leadership and the boardroom have sufficient tech savvy, to be able to lead digitisation programs and to be able to provide the sort of oversight they need in that evaluate, direct and monitor. I'm going to talk about the fourth and fifth bullet points here too. Aligning technology investments with enterprise strategy. So the ability, for example, to look at where do we best manage the delivery of customer services in our enterprise? Do we use outside service providers? Do we use cloud? Do we build and deploy internally? So aligning enterprise technology investments, so this digitisation process, with enterprise strategy is a real takeaway in terms of how organisations might improve their governance of the organisation. The last one on the right here, research and employ industry best practice and security controls, and more broadly standards, is an interesting one given that a number of people that were involved in this survey were in areas where security best practice, things like ISO 27001, are not that commonly reflected. So the perception that those sorts of industry better practices might be part of the solution here perhaps is an opportunity for us in the industry. The one that worried me a lot was continuous security education and training. This one felt more like an operational function than a governance function, and I think perhaps my takeaway for this is we need to be talking more at our leadership around the implications of technology. My caution on security awareness training is to focus it back on the enabling capabilities of technology and not the risks of technology failing. So we too often hear, and I guess much of the conference is all about risks and threats. But business leaders are trying to invest in outcomes. And so in order to invest in outcomes, we need to be able to measure not just risk and threat to outcome, but how do we better enable opportunity? So the security awareness training gap that I see here is that organisations too often talk about security awareness from the threat side and not how can security enable better business. How can security work with our organisation to innovate, to better control our core assets, our key assets, to better respond to incidents, and probably foremost, how our organisational staff understand the technology that we use and their role in ensuring that the outcomes are being met and the risks are being reduced. So there's some interesting takeaways that come from this, and I think I'm still reading more into the data sets that I'm being given about trying to find out where we need to perhaps take this research in the next direction, in the next iteration, I mean. It may well be that awareness one also requires us to, and I've often used the word for security folk as being the Babel fish, or translation engine, if you like, in the organisation, that security folk tend to be the ones that understand the technology and the risks around technology, but they also tend to understand the business. I guess as an assurance or an audit person as well, and as a risk person, that's tended to be my focus. But if you go into IT, you tend to see an IT perspective of the world, and if you go into the business, you tend to get a business sense of the world. So there's a real task ahead for us to help the organisation understand this nexus between digitisation and opportunity and growth and risk and threat. So a key goal for leadership in terms of the most effective governance opportunities that our leaders could bring to us is for their ability to be able to address the right issues at the right time. And that includes understanding strategies and programs of change, understanding digitisation and how that will transform business and the risks and opportunities that arise from that. For them to be able to ask the right questions about various investments, including just simple things like outsourcing, offshoring, the implications of digitisation, the implications on our customer base, on how that might affect the way in which the business might choose to use its resources available to it. And the last bullet point here is their ability to address the strategy in the right way. So a company may say that they need to digitize, they need to automate, they need to use, perhaps be more efficient in production and execution of process through things like machine learning or automation. But business leaders need to be able to understand the strategy and ask questions about that strategy and its implications for the business. The diagram on the side there really is the potential universe of opportunities that they need to be able to embrace and understand and perhaps evaluate so that when they ask those questions, they've got the right outcomes in mind. One of the things that the research led to, and this evolved at a little bit of a separate time amongst ISACA, was that the ISACA research participants identified risk management, cybersecurity, and that business integration with IT as some key areas of challenge. At the same time, ISACA, I'm not sure if you're aware, but ISACA acquired a couple of years ago what was the Carnegie Mellon Capability Maturity Model Integration Institute. That's now an ISACA organisation. And between ISACA and CMMI, they looked at how could we help create a platform, or a tool, a method that organisations might use to better evaluate, firstly, their current risk posture, secondly, their cybersecurity state, and things like their capability. So you'll see a couple of dimensions here of a thing called the Cybersecurity Readiness and Resilience platform. And the first one really looks at SecOps, security operations, and asks an organisation questions around three key areas. What are the mission priorities and the dependencies? What does the threat space look like for that organisation? And how well and secure is the technology to deliver on their mission and outcomes? So it takes a very much sort of a cybersecurity focus on one side. On the other side, it looks at capability maturity. Does the organisation have the capabilities it needs to manage the business going forward through the transformation, digitisation? Does it have those capabilities? Does it have resources to find those capabilities if they're external? And the last domain here is workforce readiness, and that is whether or not the organisation is capable of delivering the digitised or the new business that the organisation is aiming to do, or is it vulnerable, the typical kind of human vulnerabilities that we have. So to what degree is the organisation's workforce ready to take on opportunities for the organisation? So this platform, cyber maturity platform, was deployed just a couple of months ago, and the organisation, ISACA and CMMI, have these sort of outcomes in mind as to how it might help us resolve some of the research findings that we had before. The first one, to help us look at standardising maturity, so defining some maturity and getting some benchmark information across how organisations are doing various activities in relation to enterprise IT. The second one was to help define for organisations their risk profile and perhaps set some maturity targets based around either industry or their own internally developed maturity targets. The third area was looking at roadmap development, so looking at how might that organisation prioritise gaps in its capability, maturity in a roadmap, and then how might that lead to where they best position their investments going forward. And the last one, the last one here is looking at compliance. So providing a lens, if you like, on the capability assessment that's been done and looking at things like COBIT 5, ISO 27001, the NIST cybersecurity framework, etc., and others. So there was a few different dimensions here that were provided in this platform, the cyber maturity platform, that would help organisations get a feel for their current state of governance, if you like. A third part of the research that was undertaken was looking at some organisations and their own case studies around how they approach the sort of systemic innovation and governance within their organisation. The three case studies that are published by ISACA are very varied organisations. The first one is called Mednet International. It's an Athens, Greece-based organisation that's a service provider into the insurance industry. The second one was Kimberly-Clark, and it was looking at how they're looking into robotics and automation in manufacturing. And the third one is a local organisation, a Sydney-based organisation called Tyro, which is a fintech. I wouldn't call it a startup. It's 15 years old now, but I think they still think of themselves as a startup. Tyro is a fintech company that's moved from just payments into business lending and also deposits. So there's some guidance that's been developed as a result of the research that provides you with some lenses into how different types of organisations have approached some of the challenges and how they've built some more systemic solutions into their governance model. I'm actually open for questions. That was fairly quick, the content of the research. I'm open for questions you might have around governance and how we deliver better outcomes through better technology governance. So any questions?
Caught me off guard there. Thanks, Gary.
Caught him off guard. I told him it wouldn't take me the full quid. So.
All right. Are there any questions for Gary? I didn't see any online submitted via the app. So does anyone have any questions they want to ask? We've got plenty of time. No? Well, I'd like to thank Gary. Round of applause, please.